What's going on, everybody? So before I bring you today's discussion, I just want to issue a general disclaimer. Every time I have a guest on here, they're going to say a lot of things I disagree with. And some of the things I disagree with, I'm going to let slide for the sake of the conversation as a whole. So don't take it for granted that just because I'm not objecting to something in particular, that I agree with that. Now, many of the things that I let go, these might be conversation topics for the future, but we can't have every conversation all at once. So I just want people to understand why I'm not objecting to every possible thing. With that said, I want to thank both my guests today, Mike and James. These are both very busy guys. They were more than generous with their time, and I really appreciate that, and I appreciate that they share my goal of furthering political dialogue. So thank you to both of them, and I hope you guys enjoy this discussion. Well, if you guys just want to start by introducing yourselves, we can start with Mike.
Yeah, so my name is Mike. I go by Mike Nificent on social media. I have Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube, obviously. And I live in Florida. I've been in politics, I'd say, for like 2 years. I've never been politically engaged until the 2016 election when I kind of felt like I was forced into the political scene. I was just aware of everything, and then the more I learned, the more I started to understood where I fall on the spectrum. And I don't think you can really categorize me in one box or the other. I'm just kind of nuanced and I'm always evolving what I think and believe, and I'm just doing what I can to make sense of the world, like we're all trying to do. Just trying to
Right on,
see a
man.
better world.
James?
Yes, I'm James. I work for the Daily Express, which is a conservative newspaper in the UK, a kind of conservative national paper. I used to work for Conservative MP. I don't anymore. But I've been involved in political campaigning for quite a few years. And a few months ago, I set up a group called the Campaign Against Corbynism, which is a campaign to stop Jeremy Corbyn, who's the Labour leader in the UK, the current Prime Minister. So it kind of focused on opposing the far left, the extreme left. So that's kind of my background. I've got a YouTube channel as well, but it's not as big as Mike's, unfortunately.
Okay, and so obviously the conversation here today is built around the fact that Mike is a Trump supporter and James, you don't care for Trump.
Yes.
And so we're just going to dig into that and see what's behind that. So if you, James, you want to start with why you don't really like Trump?
Yeah, my concern about Trump from a kind of conservative perspective. I'm not attacking him from the left. It's kind of a critique from the right. I have my view of conservatism is that it fundamentally should be about conserving what made the West great, to use a Trumpian phrase. So that's individual liberty, democracy, the kind of the fundamental core values that made the Western society, put Western society above other alternatives. And I've always been very concerned about Trump's attachment to some of those core values. For example, during his 2016 election campaign, I was very unnerved by the authoritarianism of some of what he was saying. For example, when he repeatedly refused to concede defeat, if he was defeated, he refused to say that he would say he lost if he did lose. The fact that even after he won the electoral college vote, he still claimed that he'd been deprived of an outright victory by millions voting illegally. I don't think there's any evidence of that. So I've always been very unnerved by Trump's authoritarianism and by his tendency, in my view, to cuddle up to dictators. And in my view, that's very much not what conservatism should be about. I think that undermines conservatism. But obviously, I'd very much like to know what Mike has to say on the subject as well.
Yeah, feel free to just jump in, Mike.
Okay, yeah, I was gonna let you finish. Well, obviously, I'm not gonna sit here and defend everything Trump's ever said, everything Trump's ever done. I don't agree with everything anyone says or does, so I always like to preface that before I essentially defend Trump, because it's not really a defense of Trump. It's more of a defense of my values and then the way that I view American politics. In my short time here, I haven't been in the world forever. I don't know a whole lot about. I've done my research and I've learned history, but having not experienced it for myself, I can only really go off of what's in a textbook or what I've read or through someone else's accord. With that said, like I said, when in 2016, you know, Obama was finishing up. I was not thrilled with Obama's presidency whatsoever, even though I voted for him twice. Yada, yada, yada. Everything happened with 2016. I don't want to rehash like the election process, but I wasn't very thrilled with either candidate. Quite frankly, I didn't choose Trump in 2016, but I wasn't a Hillary Clinton fan. I mean, we don't need to go down that road of what kind of person she is. I think she's one of the worst human beings on the planet. But after the 2016 election, I started to see the way the media went on the attack towards not only Trump and Trump supporters. Okay, so I lived in Minnesota, which is a super liberal state. I'd never lived in a liberal state before I moved there. And everyone hated Trump. The day after the election, people were crying. There were petitions going around work. People were talking even to me as though I hated Trump the way they did. It was very arrogant in a sense because I didn't feel any type of way after he won. I was like, oh, shoot, what's this mean? You know, I'm like, I guess I'll give him a chance. I've never had a Republican president as an adult, you know, as a taxpayer. So we'll see what happens. So I had a very open mind, but everyone around me seemed very closed-minded. And that was my first, you know, red flag to like, what's going on? I thought liberals were very open-minded and progressive. So then fast forward, I moved to Florida. I meet nothing but Trump supporters when I moved to Florida. And I'm like, wait a minute. I thought all Trump supporters were racist and he's a bigot and blah, blah, blah. So I ended up getting a MAGA hat because I'm like, I'm going to do a social experiment. If Trump is racist, if Trump supporters are racist, I'm going to go to his rally. And if I'm ever going to experience it, it's going to be in the dirty South, racist Florida, right? At a Trump rally. I went to that rally and people were high-fiving me, complimenting me on my MAGA hat, even though they had the exact same hat on. It was just almost a life-changing experience. And I began to look more critically at the media. And the media, I think, plays the biggest role in swaying public opinion, whether it's about Trump or about any random person, right? But because the media has been on a constant tirade against this president, I think it amplifies the hatred of him. Because the truth of the matter is, nobody had a problem with Donald Trump until he ran for president. That's just the truth of the matter. Okay, so that's one side of it. Now, as far as his like authoritarianism and all the stuff that you mentioned, I can't really speak too much about his authoritarianism because the authoritarianism that I actually experience is coming from the left, whether it's the leftist media, the dogma of liberalism, or the big tech censoring anybody with a dissenting point of view. To me, that is experiencing authoritarianism. Trump, I feel like he boasts and brags. He's braggadocious. He says a lot of stuff. He puffs his chest out, which I think is why people like him, actually, because he is not your traditional orthodox politician, if you can even call it that. He's not been like that. And so I think that's part of his appeal is just the posturing. And then also, I feel like a lot of people, I'm not going to say you because I don't know you, but there are a lot of people who oppose Trump, but will overlook other authoritarianism. So it's like, we don't like that authoritarianism, but we're going to ignore ours. So to me, that says you just want your brand of authoritarianism, which it really can come from both sides. I just feel like everyone is hyper focused on Donald Trump, when in reality, Trump is a symptom, not the problem.
Yeah. Oh, no, I mean, I completely get that. I mean, to get more specific, so from kind of like an outside perspective, a non-American perspective, I mean, I was really looking forward to having a Republican president because I didn't think Obama did a very good job, especially in foreign policy. I thought he was very weak in defending freedom, in defending what you might call American values, freedom, democracy, liberty around the world. I thought he allowed dictatorial states like Russia under Putin, Syria under Assad to get away with stuff they should not have been allowed to get away with. So I was really looking forward to another Republican president. I was hoping we'd have someone like, another Reagan who would really stand up for the free world, for the values of freedom. But obviously, instead we end up with Trump, who, if anything, his record, I think, is even worse than Obama in terms of kind of huddling up to authoritarian figures. So, I mean, this is a guy who said that he fell in love with Kim Jong-un, who's kind of one of the most brutal dictators on the planet. And I just have a fundamental issue with the kind of the way he associates himself so neatly with so many ultra-authoritarian figures, so many dictatorial figures. And I just think that's fundamentally anti-conservative. I don't think that's what conservatism should be about. I think it undermines the values that made the Western world great. And I think at the time when, I mean, those of us in Europe would love, or some of us in Europe would love to have more American leadership. Europe's very weak, and we're very reliant on you guys to sort us out, basically. At a time we'd love to have more American leadership. It feels like Trump's stepping back from the world to an even greater extent than Obama did, and kind of abandoning the American role in protecting liberty and protecting democracy. And I think that's a real shame. And I think there are a lot of other Republicans who wouldn't have done that, who would have been much more assertive in defending Western values and defending American values. I mean, both in the United States and around the world. And I think that would have been more positive for everyone concerned.
Yeah. No, it's interesting that you brought up Ronald Reagan, because I wish that I were actually alive during Ronald Reagan's presidency so that I would have something to compare Trump to, you know? The only other Republican president that I could compare him to when I was like, old enough to pay attention would be George Bush.
Yeah.
And I was still a kid. And I just remember George Bush being a neoconservative and a globalist and a warmonger. And he represented like an old brand of conservatism, which now that that vacuum of conservatism is being filled with millennials and people who are more libertarian and open-minded. You know, you think about like the old school evangelical, closed-minded, like God hates, the F word, whatever, like those kind of old school, the satanic panic, those kind of conservatives, I think are the boomers. That's what they call them, boomers. They're kind of, they're waning a little bit. And so that vacuum is being filled with a new brand of conservatism. That's why I think Trump was a necessary change agent, because when you talk about like how he's cozying up to these dictators, is he really doing that? Or is he just trying a different strategy and approach than the previous, 4 to 5 presidents who just kicked the can down the road with Kim Jong-un? I mean, look at the historic summit. He's the first president to cross the Korean Peninsula. That's history. That's going to go down in history. Unfortunately, they're going to paint it in the history books because it's controlled by the indoctrination machine of the left. They're going to paint that in history books as, look at one dictator cozying up to another. They're going to do it through that lens. It's always something negative and disparaging when it comes to Trump. It doesn't matter. If he cured cancer tomorrow, they would say he didn't cure it 6 months ago. What about AIDS? That's how they view the president. And I believe it's totally unfair, and it's so biased. So like saying, oh, he talks nice about Kim Jong-un. I mean, what's wrong with trying to be diplomatic? Because we were on the brink of war with North Korea when Trump came in office. And now they've all but stopped firing and testing their ICBMs. They're still shooting missiles, but we're no longer seeing North Korea as a direct threat to the United States. And it's because of this president taking a different approach. So when you talk about like conservatives and Trump doesn't represent what you see as conservative, I'm going to push back and say, well, the neocon establishment of conservatives have conserved nothing. The left has come after our Second Amendment. They come after freedom of speech. The GOP in the United States has gone AWOL. They don't stand up to the authoritarianism of the left, the smears, the libeling. Every single Republican who's run for president has been called racist. They just lay down and take it. It wasn't until Donald Trump that the Republican Party showed any resemblance of a spine where they're actually hitting back and pushing back. This is why they hate Trump, because Trump is not what they're used to. The left is a bully. I think we can all agree that there are bullies on the left, whether you're talking about in the media, entertainment, politicians. They fuel violent rhetoric, and they're all hurling it at anybody who supports Trump. And so Trump has the gall to push back against them. So the way I see it is, not to be too long-winded, he's just using rhetoric. He's just trying different things. And so far, I'm liking what I see.
Yeah. I mean, I completely, so on the point that there are a lot of people on the left in the media who, whatever Trump does or whatever any Republican do, will respond by demonization. That's clearly true. I mean, any Republican president would go through the same. And I accept that almost as background noise. I mean, the left's going to hate a Republican. That's just a fact. What concerns me slightly more is when elements of the conservative media join in. So when publications like National Review start raising serious questions, as they did ahead of the 2016 election, that for me raises more alarm bells. So, I mean, for example, we're talking about the Korean example specifically. And I think it's a really interesting example because Trump did a lot. I mean, he went out of his way to meet Kim Jong-un. He had a more favorable and friendly relationship with the North Korea than any previous American president. I just don't see what he's achieved out of this other than giving North Korea a massive propaganda win. I mean, he's made Kim Jong-un look like a kind of serious world statesman rather than a mass murdering psychopath, which is what he is. And I don't see what he's gained. So, I mean, you're right that they stopped testing their missiles. They still have nukes. And they can still deploy them if they wanted to. I mean, they may have slightly slowed down the time they can take them to reach the western seaboard of the US. But I just don't see the fundamental wins. I see a lot of concessions coming from Trump. And I just think that's weakening the Western world, weakening the Western alliance. I mean, I thought it was really interesting what you said about neocons, because I think there's a kind of view that conservatism is almost in two camps. There's kind of the nationalist camp and the neocon camp. So the neocon camp is George Bush, invasion of Iraq, etc. And the nationalist camp is Trump, relative isolationism. I think that's a bit simplistic. I mean, I think there's clearly some truth to it. I think going back to Reagan, that's kind of my ideal Republican president. A president who stands up for democracy, for freedom, for American values abroad, including where necessary with the use of military force, and who promotes democracy and liberty and capitalism, free markets, all the things we all love, but who knows that there's a line in terms of interfering in the internal politics of other countries. So, I mean, Reagan won or played a very big role in winning the Cold War. I mean, his legacy, to some extent, was the destruction of the USSR, one of the most kind of ghastly authoritarian states in human history. I don't see what Trump's legacy is to match that. All I see so far is that he's kind of made some semi-friendly relationships with some tyrants, which is totally understandable, but I don't see what he's got in return. I don't see what the payback is, and that's what concerns me.
Fair enough. I would say that it's a little premature to judge Trump's legacy because he still has 5 years to go. We don't know what's going to happen. Like I said, if any other president you can name had made any kind of progress with North Korea, not only would it not be called, normalizing a brutal dictator, they would be getting the Nobel Peace Prize. The fact of the matter is, if Barack Obama did what Donald Trump has done with North Korea, brokering peace, by the way, everyone forgets the fact that North Korea and South Korea are cordial now. They're shaking hands. They're meeting, right? That is good for the world. That shouldn't even be a partisan divide. And yet somehow it is because of the president, because of what I like to call, and I'm not saying you have this, but what I call in the United States, Trump derangement syndrome. People are so blinded by their visceral hatred for this president that they can overlook anything that makes sense. It makes sense that North and South Korea aren't at each other's throats. It makes sense for anybody to broker peace in the world. Aren't we looking for a peaceful globe? But it seems to me because people hate Trump, they just look for anything to criticize. Like I said, if he cured cancer, they would find a way to politicize it and say, well, this is wrong. This is overreach of executive power. They would say whatever they could just to paint it in a bad light, which I think is very dangerous. When you think about, when we look back on history, the youth are going to look at something that was really good and see it as bad, even though we're living it right now. And whether or not you like Trump, it's actually a good thing that we're trying a different approach with Kim Jong-un, with Vladimir Putin. And oh, by the way, we can't forget about the fact that no one ever wants to talk about China and their violation of human rights, albeit it's not a dictatorship, right? It kind of is. It's a communist Chinese dictatorship. But why do we ignore that? Why do we ignore it? Is it because China's beliefs are more aligned with the political left, even though they won't admit it because China's communist? They won't admit it, but they are more aligned, where it's a totalitarian nanny state, all just total government control and regulation of all industries. That's what China is. And then their human rights violations, but no one wants to talk about that. It's always just, here's how we can look at Trump. Trump, like I said, is the necessary change agent. He's like the wrecking ball that has taken out the political establishment, and now they're scrambling. So what we're seeing now is the true colors, the true nature of what the mainstream, both parties, by the way, right? I don't see this as a Democrat, Republican, or even liberal conservative. I try to even move away from that. I see it as the establishment, the globalists, the people who do not have the United States' best interests versus Trump, who is nationalistic minded, which I think a lot of people are behind that. A lot of people want that. Every country should put its own interests first. It's not about being isolationist. It's about, whoa, sometimes you need to pull back the other way. Like there was a time in the United States where we needed more liberalism. We needed progression, right? Yeah. And we got that. Now it's gone too far to the left and we need to pull back. Right now, the United States needs to be conservative.
Okay, did you bring up?
Sorry, I thought you asked a really interesting. I'll very quickly about it. I thought you asked a really interesting question about this, particularly on queer. I don't want to get too hung up on queer, but I thought if it was a really interesting point. When you asked what was happening if Obama had done what Trump had done, and I agree, there would be people on the left who would say he's doing a great job. He's reaching out to our enemies. He's making peace. And obviously Obama got a Nobel Peace Prize for doing basically nothing, which was one of the most ridiculous awards in human history. But I think it's also worth looking at the other side. I think if Obama had done what Trump had done with Korea, remembering North Korea as a communist dictatorship, I think the Republicans, the right, would have absolutely crucified him. If Obama talked about becoming, falling in love with Kim Jong-un, this dictator who's murdered, thousands and thousands of people, who runs a kind of communist dictatorship, I think the Republican Party would have rightly gone absolutely bananas. So I think it works both ways. I think there are people on both sides who only attack the opposing side and kind of give their own side too much cover, too much friendship. The other kind of semi-related point is, I agree that Trump's foreign policy, he's reached out a lot to North Korea and to Russia, but it's quite sporadic. It seems quite a scattergun. So, for example, whilst he's reached out to those, for Iran, he's taken a very hostile approach. So whereas the Iranian problem was it was still a massive problem, but it was semi-contained when Trump came to power, but by pulling out of the nuclear deal, that whole thing has been reopened. So it seems to me that on some countries, Trump's being really aggressive, almost too aggressive, and on some he's being too soft. And I don't see the logic in his positions. It seems very sort of make it up as you go along. That would be my kind of fundamental critique.
Yeah, no, that's fair, and I gotta admit, that is not in my wheelhouse to really know everything going. There's so many moving parts, you know what I mean? Especially when you're talking about like the Middle East and Israel and all those conflicts and all that stuff, all those proxy wars. I think there's a lot there that we still have to uncover, which I think that could be a whole different stream, like who's funding both sides of the wars and the military industrial complex and all that stuff, which, by the way, Trump has called out directly. He has said the military industrial complex. I like his entire stance as far as not wanting to interfere in other countries' affairs. I think that is the popular American opinion, even if you're talking about the political left. But as it relates to the politicians on both the left and the right, yeah, they have their opinions. The difference is the left has the media. The media has so much power. I would argue that the media has more power than the government, because they can shape public opinion. They craft narratives. They're the ones who broker information to us, essentially, right? They're not supposed to be partisan, but they absolutely are partisan. Whereas, yeah, if Republicans had criticized Obama, it'd be like, okay, is that going to be cemented? Is that going to be in academia? Is that going to be in textbooks, what the Republicans thought of what Obama did? Which is, again, going back to how we need conservatism to pull back against the left. They should have no control, like just straight up monolithic control over academia. That's the biggest problem, because the public school system is essentially a factory farm for a mind. You can create a mind in K through 12, right? Going back to, was it Stalin or Karl Marx? I forget who it was. Somebody from the KGB Soviet area, they were talking about how it only takes about 20 years to destroy a country from within. And you start with how you introduce propaganda and you change education. And so because the left controls that, they're able to change so there's more power within the culture than there is at the political level, if that makes any sense. And how that kind of relates to like the wars and stuff going on in the Middle East. Yeah, Trump is weird with certain countries. Yeah, I guess he has an unorthodox approach. I don't have much to compare it to other than Obama with what he did, with what Hillary Clinton would do, and with what George Bush did, and yeah, he could probably figure out some other things, but like bringing troops home from Syria, I like that. I don't understand funding, selling weapons to Saudi Arabia. Like, there's a lot of weird things there, but I don't think Trump is solely pulling the strings, which is why John Bolton had to walk. We got to figure out what's going on with Mike Pompeo. That's pretty much the gist of what I know about, geopolitics.
Well, Mike,
I was very sorry. I'll let you on.
Yeah. So, Mike, you had brought up China, and were you just bringing that up to kind of highlight hypocrisy, or did you actually have a position on China? Or do you think like Trump's more aggressive approach towards China makes sense?
Yeah, I think it does. I really brought up China as the hypocrisy, with how they look at dictatorships and authoritarian governments, pretty much governments that are antithetical to freedom and the values that we have in the United States. I would say China is by far the biggest geopolitical threat. You look at what's happening with Hong Kong, their aggression in the South China Sea, and their conflict with Taiwan, just their Belt and Roads Initiative, which a lot of people don't talk about. Nobody wants to talk about the Belt and Roads Initiative, right? When we hit the year 2049, that will be the 100-year anniversary of the Communist Chinese Revolution. And by that time, their goal is to be the most powerful, influential country in the world. Well, as a United States freedom-loving individual, I have a big problem with China already having so much influence in the United States. We're talking about what's going on with the NBA. Like, you need to fire somebody that we don't like. And the fact that people would actually take that seriously, the fact that Hollywood has to change movies and all that stuff because of they want to make money in China. So China understands how to, have influence in the world. The way that they're like colonizing different parts of the world and spreading their ideology, I think it's very dangerous.
I mean, this is somewhere where I absolutely agree with you. America is kind of the greatest country in the world fighting for freedom, and China is the main rival. It's almost the new Soviet Union. So, I mean, there was almost a period between the fall of the Soviet Union, kind of between 1990 and I don't want to give an exact year, but you could perhaps say the financial crisis, perhaps a bit later, where it seemed like the West had won. It seemed like the kind of the liberal democratic model. And when I say liberal, I mean in kind of small state terms, not in terms of the classically liberal, democratic, freedom-loving capitalist model had won. It didn't really face any serious ideological adversaries. So obviously there were countries that didn't subscribe to the same value system, like Russia, but they were kind of seen as being quite backwards and weak. What's happening now, which I think is quite scary, is that authoritarian countries, dictatorial countries with very different models, I mean, China's the best example, are becoming very powerful, almost to the point where, like the Soviet Union, they can challenge the free world again. And I do appreciate Trump taking a tough line on China. Generally, I think that he's right to recognize them as the main strategic threat to the United States and indeed to the free world as a whole. And the way that the Chinese government behaves, as you said, in Hong Kong, in the South China Sea, amongst some of their own minority populations. So at the moment, there's something like, they estimate there's about 1 million Uyghurs, which is a kind of an ethnic group who live in eastern China in re-education camps. I mean, it's just horrendous, where kind of torture and abuse and rape are reported to be widespread. So I completely agree with Trump taking a firm line on China. My only slight issue with it is that sometimes I feel it's overly economic. So I get that China's trade practices are not fair. That's a completely valid point. But at the same time, where possible, I prefer to maintain free trade. I think that some of Trump's tariffs they undermine the kind of the flow of the free market, if that makes sense. So I completely agree with him cracking down on China. That's great. I'm 100% behind him on that. I'm just a little bit nervous about some of the economic tariffs he's put on and whether they're anti-competitive and whether that's actually going to undermine the kind of the free market system which we should be trying to defend.
Mm-hmm. Well, as it relates to what you said, like you think Trump kind of undermines the free market and the flow of trade and everything with the tariffs.
Yeah.
Ask yourself, why is he doing this? Why are we even in this situation if not for previous leaders selling us out without jobs going overseas? without the deterioration of American cities, the Rust Belt. You know, a lot of people lost their jobs, their livelihoods because of bad trade deals with China. So all Trump is trying to do is right the wrong. He's trying something different. You know, when everything else fails, try something different. And we don't know how this is all going to play out. I have my own theory that I think China's holding out until after the 2020 election because they have a vested interest in how it plays out, which tells you again why Trump was so necessary. The Chinese government probably thinks, well, Joe Biden would just get us back to the status quo, which we would be winning, which would be back on track to our 2049 goal. Whereas Trump represents a fly in the ointment. Trump was like the brakes, like, wait, we're going to do something different, right? So what he's doing is necessary. It needs to be done. Somebody needed to stand up to China, and we finally have a president that's doing it.
I mean, I think you made a really, really interesting point. I mean, I think you almost highlighted kind of one of the main divisions within global conservatism. So there's the ultra free market view, which is that all free trade is good and we should trade wherever we can on whatever basis we can. And there's the more nationalist view, which is that we have to sometimes protect our own industries with tariffs. I incline slightly more to the first view. I think that free trade, in the same way that free markets within a country create prosperity. Capitalism and people starting their own businesses and the government just generally getting out of people's way. I think that's a great way of producing wealth within a country. I think the same thing works on a global scale. So I think the more people you have who can kind of do business with each other and the less government intervention getting in the way in terms of things like tariffs, the better. I do accept, though, and you make a very good point here, that some of the trade practices that countries like China use were appalling, and they were stealing a lot of American intellectual property. And I sympathise with Trump for cracking down. I just slightly think he might have gone a little bit too far. And I just like to see him spending more time kind of advocating the free market ethos, the kind of the freedom ethos. So if he does have to put tariffs in place to counter a particularly bad Chinese practice in one area, I can totally understand that, but I'd really like it if he then made it clear that that's only because China's misbehaving in this one area, and that generally he's fully in favour of free markets, of free trades, of the capitalist model. Obviously, Trump's a capitalist, but I would like to see the kind of the global economic policy more aligned along those lines. And if he does have to put some tariffs in, which I accept he does have to do, I'd like to still see him combine that with making a strong general case for free markets.
Yeah, and I don't want to sound like I'm not for free trade. I definitely am for free trade, but I think every once in a while the terms need to be renegotiated, and we're basically in the middle of a renegotiation where sometimes negotiations are tough. You have to walk away from the table. You got to know when to hold them and when to fold them, right? As they say, that cliche statement. It's kind of like that. That's kind of where we are with everything. I can't really speak too much to the tariffs. I don't really understand the nuances of tariffs other than when I worked in corporate retail, and that's pretty much it. But I think there's probably other options. I think that especially as it relates to like big tech and Silicon Valley, the way they've sold out the country, they've shipped a bunch of jobs overseas. Like think about American companies that have vested interests in the Chinese government, like Nike, with their cheap labor that they get over there. Why aren't there more incentives for these American companies to go to other countries or to bring jobs back home? The ones that they can actually, have here. I don't think we can necessarily manufacture Nike tennis shoes in America. We could maybe, but that's neither here nor there. I would like to see more government hands-off, maybe as it relates to taxes or incentives for companies to move home, which is a roundabout way to weaken the leverage of China, right? Because when you're negotiating, a lot of it has to do with leverage. Who has the leverage? I think the United States has more leverage than China. We have a bigger economy. We're their biggest customer, right? But they're not our only supplier. So we have options there. And I think Trump recognizes that. And the very fact that Trump's even trying to do anything tells me that he actually does care. And that's why it pisses me off that you have so many fake conservatives and people who don't truly care about the United States' best interest attacking and criticizing him instead of getting behind him. They should be behind him 100% of the way. if they truly care about the interest of the American public.
Okay, Mike,
Yeah.
I have a
Sorry.
question for Mike. So if Trump negotiates the terms, what are the best terms you imagine for America? What are we trying to negotiate towards? Because if you're someone like James, I would think like the less restrictions getting in the way of trade, the better. But you see things differently. What do you think is that outcome you're looking for, or that Trump's looking for?
I can't really speak to what he's looking for. I'm not really sure what like the best outcome is. I'm just giving my input onto what I see the problem is. I'm not saying like I have the solution. Here's what we need to do. I'm just saying I like that somebody's standing up to China. Someone is standing up to
I
a
do
country
agree
that's
with you
bullying us, if that makes sense. So I'm not even trying to pretend like I have the policy prescription or anything like that.
Okay,
I have no idea. I would sound like a fool if I just try to say this is what we need to do, because who the hell really knows? Who can honestly say this is exactly what we need to do and it's going to turn around? Nobody actually knows that. I don't even think Trump knows that. I think Trump's doing the best that he can. Could he do better? I'm sure. Could there be something else? Should there be some other options? Absolutely. I just think the way that China has been ripping us off, the way that they have been, and it goes beyond just the actual trade and how it affects us economically. It's how they're impacting us socially, how they buy like propaganda pieces and put them in newspapers and to try to undermine Trump, how they're trying to influence our election. For all this talk about Russia's trying to influence the election. Why are we ignoring the biggest threat, which is China? Again, China has a big invested interest in how the outcome of 2020 election goes. So we need to start there too. We need to be attacking. I think it's a two-pronged approach. It can't just be, well, we need better trade deals for our farmers. We need to bring factory jobs back, blah, blah, blah. That's a big part of it. But the other part is the Chinese government should have no influence whatsoever in how we run our business in this country, how our freedom of speech and everything else in this country, they should have no say so.
I mean, where I very strongly agree with Mike, I mean, China, I think right now is the biggest threat to the free world, and it's getting stronger. So you mentioned the Belt and Road Initiative, which is a kind of a Chinese attempt to drag most of Asia into its economic sphere. It's a direct challenge to the interests of kind of other powers in the region. So, I mean, at the moment, in kind of geopolitical terms, I mean, the United States of America is the main country fighting for freedom, and China is the main country fighting for authoritarianism. Now, that's a very simplified model, but that's basically true. And China is getting stronger and stronger. So I completely get that someone needs to stand up to China. I 100% behind that. And I think that increasingly China's providing almost a kind of rival ideological model. So in the same way that during the Cold War, the Marxist model, which was obviously turned out to be disastrous, but the Marxist model of the Soviet Union was seen as a kind of coherent ideological alternative to the Western model of free markets and freedom. I think now there's increasingly a kind of, some people call it state capitalist, because China is kind of capitalist, but it's a very, very authoritarian form of capitalism. It's very state infused, and it combines that obviously with extreme political authoritarianism. I mean, whatever you want to call it, but it's almost a rival model emerging. And that there are some other countries that seem interested in the Chinese model. So, I mean, the Philippines is an interesting one, where they got quite an authoritarian president. And there's quite a few countries in the region which are kind of following in the Chinese lines, whereas 10 years ago they might have more followed the United States, followed Western democracies. But I think it shows how power has moved from the West to the East, so from the United States and Europe to China. And I think that's absolutely something we should be very concerned about. And I think that on that particular point, I think Trump is completely right.
Mm-hmm. I think we have really, if you just look at it from a global perspective, we have two competing worldviews. You have the authoritarian Chinese model, and then you have the Western model, right? And I think what we're seeing is a nationalist, populist, traditionalist backlash to that global model that was really starting to rear its ugly head under the Obama administration. Because as the United States goes, so goes the rest of the world, I think. And that's why we're seeing a lot of these other populist candidates pop up, whether it's in Italy or Brazil, Hungary. There's a lot of countries, if you haven't noticed, there's civil unrest around the world. I mean, riots and protests, people are backlashing against their status quo in their country. I mean, their big government is corrupt. I mean, it doesn't matter which country it is, it's always going to benefit those at the tip top.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that's really what's happening, is just the competing models of how the world should be, how we should exist.
I really agree with that. I mean, I say I love free markets. I believe in small government. The one point I might slightly question. So I think you equate authoritarianism quite close to globalism. I think that there can be a lot of truth in that. So obviously, Marxism is a globalist ideology. It doesn't recognize state borders. It doesn't recognize the traditional countries. And Marxism is very authoritarian. But I think there are also nationalist ideologies that can be very authoritarian. So, for example, we're talking about challenges to American global dominance, and China is the big one. I agree. But Russia is also a threat, and Russia's model. I mean, and China's quite a nationalistic country. I mean, it's not. Even though it's still ruled by a communist party, theoretically, its kind of internal propaganda is quite nationalistic. And look at someone like Russia, which, as I say, is another very authoritarian country, a very nationalist model. So I think that globalism can be very authoritarianism, but I think nationalism can be authoritarian as well. I think there's a danger in saying kind of nationalism is inherently anti-authoritarianism. So another quite interesting example is you brought up Hungary. So Hungary is obviously quite an interesting case at the moment. It's got a government which is fairly nationalistic, which is it's still within the European Union. It's quite suspicious of the European Union. You could call it anti-globalist, but it is also being quite authoritarian in the way it treats its domestic opposition. So it's shutting down or putting a lot of pressure on opposition newspapers, independent media. It's been targeting kind of academics that don't agree with what it says. So I very much agree that there's a battle going between freedom and tyranny. I just don't entirely agree that it aligns along globalist nationalist lines. And I think there's good and bad people in both camps in terms of freedom.
Yeah, I want to bring it back to the United States for a second, because you have I think you may have been hinting at like Trump being a little bit authoritarian towards the media or whatever.
Yeah.
Here's what I have to say about that. The media has been punching this man in the face since he announced his candidacy, and he's punching back. And now that he's punching back, defending himself, God forbid the man defend himself against all this fake news and all these allegations that have been thoroughly debunked, and then they just double down on the lies. That's another story. God forbid he punches back and defends himself, and then they're saying, oh, he doesn't respect freedom of press. He respects freedom of press as much as any president. Yeah, he kicked Jim Acosta out from the White House. Did he not deserve it? If any conservative media pundit did that to Obama, they would want that person out of the industry. They would be run out of town. We all know this, right? It's the hypocrisy that we see in our media and our journalism. I mean, Obama locked up plenty of journalists. Obama did a lot of shady stuff that people are just, quite frankly, to call out. The emperor has no clothes. They just can't do it. They're afraid to say it. They're afraid to admit it, or they're unwilling. They just don't see it, or they're unwilling to see it. That under Obama, there were journalists jailed. He had tough comments against Fox News, and he said a lot of stuff. But because it's Trump, it's like, oh, no, it's the end of the world. He hates the media. He's authoritarian. Don't get me wrong. I do believe that nationalism can be authoritarian. We're just not there yet. I don't think we'll get there. I hope we don't get there. That's not my goal, that we're going to get there. I'm not trying to get us there. I'm saying nationalism right now is so important. When you have presidential candidates who are saying that we need to decriminalize border crossings, they are literally challenging the sovereignty of the nation that they are trying to be elected to represent. That is wicked scary to me.
No, I mean,
be running for president and saying, open the floodgates, let them in. America's very founding is immoral and wrong. That tells me our biggest threat maybe isn't China. It's a domestic enemy.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree that a country doesn't have borders ceases to be a country, essentially. And I mean, you hear some Democrats talk about abolishing ICE, abolishing borders, and that's insanity. It's incredibly dangerous. And to be honest, it's more dangerous than anything Trump suggested. And I completely agree with fighting back against that kind of thing. I mean, on the media, I agree that, I mean, the left-wing media is always going to hate Trump. They're always going to hate any Republican. I mean, to a certain extent, I kind of feel that the job of Republican is to rise above that. I mean, we all know that the broadcast media, the print media, especially in America, the broadcast media in the UK tends towards the left. It leans towards the left. I kind of think it's a job of conservatives to rise above that and just to apply with our own media rather than necessarily attacking them quite so much. I mean, I completely understand why people do, because it can be very frustrating. And I sympathise with that. But I mean, for me, it wasn't really the media that was the real red flag. So the things that really concerned me, so during the 2016 campaign, it was when Trump repeatedly refused to say that he would concede if defeated, which he said several times ahead of the 2016 vote. And he was tweeting lots of conspiracy theories about lots of illegal immigrants voting, fake ballots, fake polling stations. There was a lot of stuff going on, which I thought was very, very shady. And the other thing that concerned me is the attitude to political violence. So, I mean, Trump's not that bad. So, as I say, in the UK, we've got a guy called Jeremy Corbyn leading the Labour Party, that's the main party of the left, whose record on violence is just appalling. But Trump's nothing like in that category. But he did say some things that concerned me. So when he talked about wanting to punch protesters in the face, when he said that he offered to pay the legal bills, or one of his supporters who actually did punch a protester in the face, that kind of thing unnerved me, because it's the sort of thing I associate with authoritarian countries, not with freedom, which I kind of see as the core conservative value. I think you have to let your opponents be dicks, basically. I mean, there are people on the left who are going to be disruptive and who are going to be horrible. I think you just have to, I think they have the right to do that. You have to let them do that. And you fight back with arguments. And as soon as you start talking about punching people in the face, I start getting very queasy.
Yeah. And to be fair, two things can be true at the same time. Again, Trump was unorthodox in his approach, which I think is necessary. Again, I'm not going to defend everything he's ever said or ever does or anything like that. But we can't ignore that both sides have a tendency to do that, but it's only being talked about because it's him. And I have a problem that makes me think that people don't actually care about the problem. I'm not referring to you. I'm just saying the broader spectrum of people who criticize Trump don't criticize the fact Joe Biden has said something like, we need to box or something like that. He could have been joking. I think Trump could have been joking too. I think Trump probably was joking. We all forget that Donald Trump was an entertainer before he became a politician, right? And I think what happens is a lot of people take Trump literally, but not serious. I take Trump serious, but not literally. Yeah. Right? If he says like, oh, I'd love to punch that media guy in the face, I think the average Trump supporter laughs. They're like, Trump, you're not really going to do that. You don't have a criminal record. You don't have a violent bone in your body. Let's just be real about it. Donald Trump isn't doing that. And I don't think any of his supporters are like, yeah, we should jump the media. We should actually do that, which is why it seems like really phony outrage for people to act like, oh, my God, Trump is saying this. He's inciting violence. I'm like, you can't find me a single video on the internet of people in MAGA hats going in the streets and responding to Trump's rhetoric by punching and attacking journalists and liberals. Yeah. In fact, quite the opposite is true. If you type in right now in YouTube, still, I guarantee you, if you typed in Trump supporters attacking people, you will get a laundry list of videos of people attacking Trump supporters. The truth is stranger than fiction, like I say on my channel all the time. And the truth is, people who support this president are peaceful, they're civil, not all of them, obviously. Yeah. There's some bad apples, but they're not the straw man that represents the entire bunch of everyone else, even though they're propped up and used as straw men to smear and libel everyone else. That's not even close to the case. So like Trump's rhetoric, I think, is just a big hoax, and they use it to scare people and to mind control people, gaslight people, to make you think, oh no, Trump's inspiring violence. It's like, when I put on the MAGA hat, as a black man, I put on a MAGA hat, and that was the first time in my life where I actually experienced, like, in my face racism. But the racism came from white Democrats who called me a sellout, a traitor to my race. How can you support Trump as a black person? These are coming from white Democrats who think Trump is racist. Again, the truth is stranger than fiction. Why is that even happening? if Trump is the racist and the terrible person, why are all the terrible people coming after Trump supporters?
Yeah, I mean, I mean, that's obviously absolutely horrible. People doing that. I mean, I've seen so many videos of Trump supporters being attacked. I think there's a rally. Was it last month that got quite violent? And there were kind of videos, yeah, and there were videos of Trump supporters getting punched, and they were burning the "Make America Great Again" hats, and it was horrible. I mean, there's always been a very big problem, both in America and in Britain, of ultra-authoritarianism on the left. And to be honest, I think that's not talked about enough. I think we tend to, certainly in the UK, when you talk about political violence and authoritarianism, you tend to talk about the far right. And obviously the far right does exist. It is a problem. But the far left is generally, I think, far more pernicious and far more dangerous.
Sorry, one other point I wanted to make really quick. When you said that Trump said he wouldn't concede the election if he lost.
Yeah.
I think that's hilarious because Hillary Clinton to this day has not accepted that she lost the election. She still blames Russia, even though that has been a complete fallacy of a hoax. Hillary Clinton still floats that very real conspiracy theory. Hillary Clinton is still saying, oh, it was voter suppression. It was this, that, and the third. Like, how is that possible? It's straight up projection. For people to say, oh, they go back to Trump saying, oh, he just wants to barricade himself in the White House and he was sending out conspiracy theories about election fraud. Someone just got arrested in Michigan for tampering with ballots. It's not like what he said, even though there may not have been concrete evidence at the time. It's not like it was outside of the realm of possibility. It's not like he's saying, oh, there's aliens voting. It's been documented that the left has been ballot harvesting. Dead people are voting. They don't clear out their lists, whatever election list, people that are on the election list. I moved from Colorado like 7 years ago. They still call me to try to get me to register to vote.
Yeah. Even
though I haven't lived there in almost a decade. So election fraud is absolutely real, and Republicans are right to call it out. And by the way, you have Democrats saying undocumented immigrants should be able to vote. They say undocumented immigrants should be able to vote. They say black people are too stupid to get IDs to vote. So Republicans are suppressing their vote.
Yeah.
Right. They're constantly worried about that, which tells me they know that they can't win at the ballot box on their ideas. So they have to come up with other ways. They think we should lower the voting age to 16. They think we should abolish the Electoral College. This is insanity. Win on your ideas or don't try to change the elect. They want to change everything so that they can win, because they can't win on ideas alone.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think there's some of those points is a good deal of truth to. I mean, on the point about Hillary Clinton, I think that she's never accepted why she lost. She's never accepted that she was the problem and taken responsibility. It's always blaming someone else. Like, as you say, I mean, the Russia thing has clearly been exaggerated. I mean, I think there was attempted Russian interference in the presidential election, but I don't think that's what swung it. And I think there was definitely some people on the left who massively exaggerate that. I mean, they do that in the UK with the Brexit vote as well. There's a kind of conspiracy theory, which is quite popular on sections of the left, that Brexit was essentially a kind of Russian plot, which is just nonsense. There's no evidence for it at all. I think there's slightly more evidence of some interference in the American presidential election. But even with that, clearly with the Democrat hacks, even with that, I don't think it was decisive. So I think there are people who exaggerate it because it's useful for them to exaggerate it. But I mean, the fundamental point which does kind of concern me is that, I mean, even though she refuses to accept why she lost or refuses to take responsibility for her defeat, I mean, Clinton did concede. I mean, on the night of the election, she phoned up Trump and said, I've lost, you're president kind of thing. My concern was always, would Trump have done that if it had been the other way around? Because, I mean, his rhetoric on Twitter ahead of the election, where he was repeatedly saying that everything's rigged, the system's completely biased against me. I'm not going to concede. He repeatedly refused to say he'd concede defeat if he appeared to have lost. And of course, some of the fear. I mean, I agree. There's people voting who shouldn't be voting. But Trump's argument is that so many people were voting that he should have won the overall vote rather than just the electoral college vote. That's millions of fake votes. I mean, maybe there are, but I think you have to have some more proof before you kind of throw out assertions like that. And the other thing, this is probably where we're going to disagree, but I was unnerved by the repeated threats to imprison Hillary Clinton. So I'm very much not a Hillary Clinton fan. I've got huge criticisms of her, and I'm glad she's not the American president. But that all being the case, the chance of lock her up. I mean, what her emails were bad, but it felt to me like it was being exploited for political ends. And locking up your main political opponent is the kind of thing that I associate with banana republics, not like an advanced democracy like the United States. So that really unnerved me. And of course, there were people on the left who were just as bad, who were determined to lock up Trump and lock up Trump supporters. And I completely accept that. I just think there were some people on the right and some Trump supporters who became so vitriolic against Clinton, partly for reasons I can understand, but they forgot about kind of basic democratic values about letting your opponent, respecting your opponents, and not threatening to put them in prison and not hinting at their assassination and that kind of thing. So I feel there are faults on both sides on that one.
Yeah, I can agree with that, and I don't remember anything that he tweeted in 2016. Like I said, I wasn't even aware of what was going on until after the election. But if he tweeted that, I that would obviously be hypocritical. I think that it's not just Hillary Clinton. I think it's other people like you had Stacey Abrams in Georgia who lost a gubernatorial race, and she blamed voter suppression and racism and sexism. It's pretty much a playbook of excuses you can make to scapegoat your failures. And I think it's very dangerous that people at the highest positions of power are using that playbook, because that tends to flow down to everyone else to make excuses for why they have come up short in one area or the other, and then float insane conspiracy theories, like even as of 2 days ago, where Hillary Clinton said that Tulsi Gabbard is being groomed by the Russians to be a third-party candidate. There's no basis in that claim at all, and it's very dangerous. It's so dangerous, and that's why the thing is, there's definitely problems on both sides. But again, going back to how the left is the big bad Goliath. They are huge in their influence. They have Hollywood, they have media, they have all academia, and a lot of the rhetoric that comes from the left trickles down and manifests in the form of violence and protests. And I think if people truly care about making a better world, a better country, we will attack that, because that is the real problem right now. It's not to say that there are not conservative bad actors. There definitely are. But what influence do they have? Everyone likes to talk about people like David Duke and Richard Spencer and all. They can barely have Twitter accounts. What influence do they have? Twitter will suppress the reach of my tweets. So imagine what they're doing to a David Duke. Like, these people have no political influence. They have no economic power. They have no social influence. So why are we talking about them and trying to breathe life into a movement that pretty much died a long time ago? They're statistically irrelevant. They don't matter, but we focus on them, when over here you've got this big bad machine over here just churning out propaganda, hateful rhetoric, calls to action and violence, all these big corporate funded protests and marches and rallies and stuff. They're just pretty much stoking division. They're subverting our country that way by division, right? If we're divided, we fall. United we stand, divided we fall. Another cliche thing. I believe it's very true, and our country has never been more divided in my life than it has been under this president. And I don't think it's because of this president. It is in a sense that him being president alone, if he were a mute and he were the president, it would still cause division, because it ruptured a very fine-tuned machine that was just humming along, rolling over everybody.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree. So certainly my impression of American politics is that there's far more violence directed at Trump supporters than by Trump supporters. And I clearly the attempt to equate the Trump movement with the actual, because David Duke and Richard Spencer, this is basically kind of a fascist fringe. I mean, obviously the term fascist is massively overused, but for someone like Richard Spencer, it's broadly appropriate. It's a tiny, tiny fascist fringe that gets, I mean, Charlottesville was their big rally, and they got, what, was it 2,000 people, 3,000 people for a country of 320 million? It's not that impressive. So there are definitely people on the left who massively exaggerate the strength of the far right and try and equate it with the broader Trump movement. My concern is that whilst we should be calling them out for this and saying that this is horrible, I think at the same time we have to make sure that we're not hypocritical, and that when we say, you guys, we're completely against violence. Please stop. Don't engage in violence. But violence approach is wrong. We need to make clear that applies to us as well. Because I agree that most violence is directed at Trump supporters. But there have been cases in Trump rallies where anti-Trump protesters have been punched and that kind of thing. And I think I alluded to this earlier, but in one case, Trump then offered to pay their legal fees. That kind of thing, I think we have to rise above the attacks from the opposition. It's very much the same here in the UK. So political violence from the left is almost routine, and kind of harassment. So, for example, our shadow chancellor, so the guy who will be running the British economy if the Labour Party wins a general election, is a guy called Jeremy Corbyn. He saluted the bombs and the bullets of a group called the IRA, which used to kill Conservative politicians in Britain. And so not just beat them up, literally shoot them. And so there was a bomb attack on the Conservative Party conference in 1984 that killed a Conservative Party MP. And 2 weeks later, Jeremy Corbyn, who is now the leader of the Labour Party, invited former convicted bombers from the same group to the British Parliament. So there's huge issues to talk about left-wing violence. Just yesterday, for example, so I don't know how much you've been following stuff in the UK, but there's been a lot of stuff with Brexit leaving the EU. And yesterday there was a really big crunch vote, and there was a huge demonstration against Brexit. And there were some quite nasty scenes. So there's a Conservative politician called Jacob Rees-Mogg, who's kind of very small C Conservative traditionalist. But he got surrounded. He was with his 10-year-old son, something like that. And they got surrounded by protesters, calling them traitors and scum, and kind of all the way from one end of Whitehall to the other, with hundreds of people abusing him. It's horrible to watch. I just think it's important that Conservatives make sure we don't go down the same route, and that when people in our movement do that kind of thing, we call it out. And that's just that's what makes me nervous about Trump. That's why I was never really a Trump fan. I was always concerned that he seemed to be tolerating, not necessarily, perhaps even inciting some of this stuff, and that just made me really nervous.
Yeah, you have every right to be nervous. He doesn't go out of his way to condemn any kind of violence or anything. He doesn't do that. He's kind of got a hands-off approach, whereas we used to previous leaders saying, like, this is wrong, this is wrong, this is wrong. So he does kind of drag his feet there in that sense, I guess. That would be a criticism that I have of Trump, is he is slow to condemn, but he does eventually condemn. Like, he did condemn Charlottesville when they asked him, and he condemned it. And he said, neo-Nazis, white supremacists, those were bad people, but you had fine people on both sides. In the UK,
that wasn't his best moment.
That was problematic. That it's still, even to this day, even though it's on video, him condemning them, the mainstream media still floats the same lie. It's so damaging. I think the media does the worst out of all of it, even more than politicians. It's the freaking media. And I'm not that familiar with the media over there across the pond where you are, but there's no way it can be half as bad as it is here. I think the political violence can really flourish when you have a leftist leader like you do over there with Jeremy Corbyn, and over here in cities like Portland, where Antifa pretty much runs that city. They've all but merged with that local government, which is essentially what happens. Like, that's what happened in Mexico. The cartel runs Mexico. They don't have a government in Mexico. It's run by the cartels. That's what happens when you have a corrupt leader, is whatever strong-armed military or vigilante, whatever group it is that's, they got the guns and they run everything, they eventually just merge and they become one entity. It's just like Pablo Escobar, right? He owned the government. That's kind of where we're at in not just the UK, in the United States, is we're looking at complete lawlessness, which is, again, why we must triple down, infinity down on our defense of the First and Second Amendment, because without those two amendments, that's why they're Amendments 1 and 2, because they protect the rest of them. If those are not protected, goodbye. That's all I can say about it, man.
Yeah, I definitely think that left-wing street violence is, I assume in America, certainly in the UK, it's underreported. I've seen some of the stuff which was happening in Portland, and it really did seem quite extreme, because it almost seemed like the authorities are kind of standing by and letting it happen. You get kind of hundreds of guys dressed all in black, wearing balaclavas, and the police just sort of stood by the side, kind of watching and beat people up. And yeah, that sort of thing is horrible, and it really does need to be called out. It's exactly the same over here. So we have exactly the same movements. So groups of kind of far left anarchists who dress all in black. They turn up at practically any protest, and they'll harass and even attack anyone vaguely conservative or right wing, or even just anyone I don't agree with, basically. And it's really bad. And to be honest, the authorities, I don't think Portland, I think, was an extreme case where it really did seem the authorities weren't doing anything. But I think the authorities, they don't do enough in the UK, and they turn a blind eye. And I think that's clearly the case a lot in America. The Charlottesville thing, I think part of the reason people were uncomfortable with Trump's response, he did condemn it. That's absolutely true. He condemned it was essentially a kind of fascist white nationalist rally. I think what upset people was, by the quote, fine people on both sides. Fine people on both. Was it bad people on both sides, or it's fine people on both sides?
Fine people on both sides.
Yeah. So I think what concerned people about that is, clearly, kind of from my perspective, both sides look pretty terrible. It was a bunch of kind of fascists and white nationalists knocking the crap out of a bunch of Antifa and far left. I'm sure there was some legitimate anti-fascism protests on the anti-fascist side as well. But clearly, there were people who went in there on the left with the intention of getting to fights and getting to violence. And I think that's totally legitimate to call it out. But I just don't think that there were any fine people on the fascist side. I think that's what kind of. I think it's more. It might have been a slip of the tongue. I think it's the kind of thing that makes people a bit unnervous, because they were the far right groups. They did literally have kind of Nazi flags. It was a genuine far right march. I know the left tends to call everything far right, but whilst they do that, there is a genuine far right, and they were at Charlottesville. And I think the suggestion that some of them might have been anything other than disgusting was what concerned a lot of people. But I like to think, or at least I hope, that Trump was just kind of speaking roughly and didn't really mean that. I don't think he actually meant it as an endorsement. And obviously, as you say, he very clearly condemned the violence and condemned the neo-Nazis. I think that the clumsiness of phrase, I think, worried people. I can understand why.
He definitely shot from the hip on that one. That was pretty obvious. I personally, in that situation, would have stayed away from it and just been like, this was bad all around, instead of trying to pick out the fine people on both sides, even though there were literally people there who were good people, who were just, they wanted the statue taken down. There were people there who went to protest the statue not being taken down. They want to see history in the open. Don't go hide it in a museum, whatever. So those are the fine people, but it just felt like you didn't necessarily need to do that. You could have just said it's all bad. One interesting thing that you brought up that I really have to push back on strongly is this whole notion of far right, because when someone says far right, I'm like, far right compared to what? And right wing as it relates to what? See, the notion of left right, this paradigm of left right, I think was falsely created to divide people. There is no left right, in my opinion, because if you talk about Richard Spencer and David Duke and these people who are right wing, what about them is conservative? If they're fascist, fascism is what you would call on the left, right? Hitler was a leftist. He was a leftist. Stalin, a leftist. Mussolini, leftist. But left right, I think, has nothing to do with it. It's identitarians. There's identitarians, and those people are white, they're black, they're Muslims. There are supremacy groups in all races, but we only ever talk about white supremacist groups. It's almost as if we're greenlighting other supremacy groups, as if the ideology, regardless of race, isn't bad. It's only bad if it's white people. No, it's bad if it's anybody. And I think it's wrong to try to paint certain people on the right side when they're not conservative. What about David Duke is conservative? Does he believe in low taxes, limited government? What does he really believe in? Or does he believe Richard Spencer, for example, wants socialism for white people? Socialism is what you would traditionally put on the left, right? So Richard Spencer, and I believe Dinesh D'Souza actually even got him on camera admitting that he is a leftist. One of his favorite presidents in U.S. history, I think, was like FDR.
Yeah.
It was FDR or some other like far left president that we had. So I think this whole alt-right, far-right thing is not true. I don't think of them as right-wing or conservative. I just think you have conservative values, liberal values,
Yeah.
and
I
people
mean,
who have those.
I agree with you more than I was expecting. I mean, I totally agree that there's almost nothing in common between someone like David Duke or Richard Spencer and conservatives. I mean, you're right. On questions of economic policy, they're authoritarian, they're statist. They want an interventionist government. On questions of foreign policy, they're nearly completely isolationist. So they don't give a damn about conserving and preserving American power and freedom and liberty around the world. I think the reason that I think the problem is there's obviously an attempt to kind of like put a whole bunch of different political movements onto a quite a simple left-right dynamic, where left is statist and right is not statist. Right is small government. And I think that works very well on economic policy. I think the reason that some people call movements like people like Richard Spencer far right is because of the nationalism, because nationalism is seen as being on the right. And I think that nationalism is very integral to their ideology. So I mean, the thing about Hitler being left wing, I mean, I've heard this argument a lot, and I can understand where they're coming from. I mean, Hitler was a member of the German Socialist Party. I mean, the Nazis' full name was the National Socialist, and what was it? The National Socialist Workers' Party or something like that. I completely get where they're coming from. There's a logic to that, and obviously Hitler was incredibly statist. I think the issue with saying it's a movement from the left is it was an incredibly nationalistic movement, and generally speaking, I think the left is suspicious of nationalism, or at least kind of subscribes to a much more constrained form of nationalism. I don't think I can 100% agree with you. David Duke and Richard Spencer aren't conservatives. But I don't really think it's fair to call them leftists either. I think they're kind of their own brand, which incorporates statist economic policy, which they take from the left, but also nationalism, which they just super drive beyond anyone else, which is generally associated with the right. So I don't think they're really either left wing or right wing. I think they take elements of both and they just put them together to make an absolute monster. But I do very much agree. I think it's very unfair that the wider conservative movement is tarred by these people. I mean, people, I'm sure it's the same in America. People in the UK kind of love to suggest that conservatism is kind of one step away from authoritarian nationalism, which is one step away from fascism, which is just not true at all. And people love to try and damage the conservative movement by associating it with the extreme right. Which again I think is completely unfair, because I think they've got ideologically they've got nothing in common and they're complete enemies. I mean, the only counterpoint I'll make is there are some people who would find themselves as conservatives who I think do have an uncomfortably close relationship with the genuine far right. I mean, they may be using the conservative logo to give themselves respectability. But who do flirt with the genuine far right, and that concerns me a bit, and that then gives the left the ammunition to say there's links between the conservative and the far right.
That could be true. I want to jump in here and kind of double down on what James is saying, because I think it's sometimes hard to articulate what defines someone as right or left. People kind of like end up talking about one quality and ignoring other qualities. But if you look, I think if you really look at the trajectory of how someone moves over to what we're calling the far right, the identitarians, are they moving through like someone like Bernie Sanders, and then all of a sudden they become a Nazi? Or are they more moving through someone like Steven Crowder and then Stefan Molyneux, and then arriving towards a more like Nazi ideology? I don't know exactly how to articulate how that is right wing, but it seems more connected to it. Even though I admit someone like Richard Spencer is also a socialist. He is. Yeah. He's pro. He's like what's good about like Sweden and Norway that allows them to be socialist is they're so homogenous. So he fuses those. So there can be left-wing ideologies that connect it that connect to Nazism, but is the Nazism itself socialist or leftist? I mean, yeah, it's all very confusing, but
it's very confusing, and I haven't seen any evidence that these radicalized identitarians are being radicalized by a Steven Crowder. I've heard smears from the leftist media that are painting Steven Crowder as a gateway to white supremacy. They also do that with Ben Shapiro, who is an Orthodox Jew. So I'm not really sure how Ben Shapiro is radicalizing the same people. Do you get where I'm going with this? They're saying that basically I talk the same way as them. So to say that those types of voices are leading people to identitarian far right extremism, they would be saying that I'm radicalizing those people too, which would be next to impossible. I mean, Candace Owens has been called a white supremacist. Yeah, so it's like, who is painting these narratives? Where's this coming from? Who is upstream from this conversation right now that we're having about people being radicalized to the right by people like a Steven Crowder versus a Bernie Sanders? What I think is happening, how they find themselves radicalized, is because of the way that we have basically an onslaught of anti-white PR. Everything is racist. Whiteness is wrong. Everything's white supremacy. Everything that white people do have ruined minorities. Even to this day, it's all bad. White people don't need to exist. We need safe spaces for all minorities. I think it's pretty damn dangerous, quite frankly, because you're looking at that point for some kind of racial conflict. If you're going to demonize one race, right? We don't need to talk about the past, which we all know what the past is. It's obvious, it's horrible, but is the correct response to that to swing the pendulum the other way and let's demonize one race and back them into a corner and silence their ability to speak on the internet? I think what that does is drive them underground into radicalized echo chambers like 4chan, 8chan, all these other places. They do exist. Again, they're statistically irrelevant, but the thing is, they're taking a conservative ideology, fundamental principles of conservatism, and they're gluing it together with those people who are driven underground while also demonizing those people and not giving them a voice to speak. And so why I think conservatives get caught in the weeds with this is we defend their freedom of speech, whereas the left is like, the world's better without them. Send them underground, go in mom's basement and type on your 8chan because you don't belong on Twitter, you don't belong on Facebook, whereas conservatives are like, actually, they do belong on the internet. The best disinfectant is sunlight. That is the conservative view. So what they see that as is, well, you're cozying up to them. You must be one of them. That's kind of how I see it. So I'm pushing back a little bit on that because I just can't see it as right-wing flirting with them and Steven Crowder, Ben Shapiro, and myself radicalizing.
Here's why I think that's not completely true, because I think you find people on the left who defend the right of even Nazis to speak to have like some sort of platform online, and they say the same thing. They say sunlight is the best disinfectant, but somehow when they do it, it looks less to someone like me as it looks like there's like putting a big distance between them and the more Nazi identitarian figures. So I don't think people on the right have a monopoly on defending that kind of free speech.
No, I don't think they do either. I'm not saying that they do have a monopoly. I think conservatives have a tendency to be more out in the open about it. Like, it's going to be amplified if a conservative does it. If a liberal does it, I haven't seen it. I'm not saying that they don't do it, because liberals should defend freedom of speech. If you believe in freedom of speech, that includes especially the people who you don't like, right? We don't defend freedom of speech so that people can say puppies are cute. It's because there's a lot of bad speech and it should be allowed to be spoken, and let them have their views. Let them have their ideas compete in the marketplace, and the best ones will always rise to the top. I just think that to try to say like people like Bernie Sanders would have any influence. I don't even think they're paying attention to politicians. At first, they were saying, oh, yeah, hail Trump and all this stuff because Trump was talking about immigration. But they support Trump on immigration for a very different reason than someone like me would support Trump on his stance on immigration, if that makes sense. And in fact, a lot of these figures who we are calling alt-right, they don't like Trump. They don't like what Trump has done. Richard Spencer was a guest on CNN like a month ago, which tells you what the state is of those kind of people and what they think of Trump. If CNN would bring Richard Spencer on and platform him to attack the president, not only does that make the media look extremely desperate, but it tells you where Richard Spencer's head is at. He doesn't think Trump is racist enough.
Right. Well, I mean, no one's disagreeing that Richard Spencer is more far right than Trump. So, I mean, that's understandable from like my perspective as well.
I mean, there's 2 points I'd really make. So I think that the key unit for any conservative is the individual. So you shouldn't care what someone's race is or what their religion is or what their sexuality. None of that stuff matters. The key unit is the individual. And obviously, beyond that, there are family groups and then there are nations and so on. The key unit for collectivist ideologies, and I think there are collectivist ideologies, clearly there are some on the left which focus on your race or your religion or your social class, a whole series of different things they can focus on. I think there are some groups which, whether you want, I mean, I think traditionally you call them on the right, and I can understand why. There are some people on the right who also think in terms of groups rather than individuals. So there are some pundits who describe themselves as conservatives who I think don't really adhere to the view that every individual matters and every individual is equally important and that we shouldn't talk about things in terms of groups. So to give a kind of random example, Milo Yiannopoulos, who is obviously, he describes himself as a conservative, was quite a prominent commentator. But you see the things he says about Muslims, and he's saying really quite nasty stuff. And it's exactly the same kind of collectivist thinking that you get on a section of the left. I mean, obviously there's a difference between it. I mean, but both of them are thinking of people in terms of groups. So you're a Muslim or you're a non-Muslim or you're white or you're black or whatever. They're not thinking of them as individuals. And I do think that some of the people on the right who are kind of talked of, the kind of Stephen Crowder types are sometimes talked of as stepping stones to the far right. I think sometimes they think in collectivist terms as well. And I maybe that stops in the rhetoric of the left, but I think that's dangerous as well. So I think there are faults on both sides, but I think there are some people who consider themselves on the right who also think in collectivist terms, who don't think in individualistic terms. I mean, I wouldn't consider them conservatives, but I think that's why people make a connection between the right and the extreme right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's fair. They're on opposite ends of whatever we would call the spectrum. What I would say is their beliefs, whether they're Richard Spencer or Louis Farrakhan, they are outside of the mainstream conversation. Whether you are liberal or conservative, even what I would really consider to be far left, like Antifa, I think they are absolutely far left. That is the far left.
Yeah, I agree.
A true far right, for me, far right, would, like someone to the right of me, I would think is someone who is, they like the idea that America be a sovereign nation, we lock down our borders, but they're looking at it through statistics. For example, basically black and brown people commit more crime. That's the truth. Okay, that's a factual statement, but they're looking at ethnicity and stuff like that. But they're not looking at it through like they're less than me, they're worse. They're saying we have to stop this because of this reason. We need to conserve because of this reason. Those are people I would consider farther right than me, but I don't necessarily think they need to be demonized. They're going off of what they see the problem is, but they're not speaking in a sense of like we need to eradicate these people. They're less than. They're not coming from the Hitlerian worldview. But they're further to the right of me, whereas I don't care what a person looks like. Not all black people commit crime. Not all white people don't commit crime. I can see it very logically. I think you guys obviously do that too, right? You don't care what color someone's skin is or who they sleep with or anything like that. I think also there's a Christian aspect or a religious aspect that is considered more conservative than myself. But then you would have to include the Muslim faith in that too, because a lot of Muslim beliefs are antithetical to the modern left, right? They clash. They have competing priorities, yet they're still kind of seen as on the left. So the whole thing is kind of convoluted when you look at it.
Totally,
right?
yeah.
It's just I make it a point to disidentify from what we call far right extremists, like Richard Spencer and all the other people I can't think of their names. And then also want to make a point that if we truly care about these people and the problems that they present, then we should call out all of it. All supremacy is wrong. I think it's all bad. I don't care if it's a black separatist group or a Hispanic separatist group or a white separatist group. I see it all the same. But not everybody sees it that way. They see it as like, well, we got to demonize the whites because they're the ones. They're the bad ones. It's like, no, all these people want the exact same thing. They're just different colors while they want it.
I think it becomes inherently dangerous when you stop seeing people as individuals and start seeing them as members of a wider group, and then their behaviour they're kind of held responsible for the behaviour of that wider group. And this isn't a kind of a left or right way thing, but both sides count. I mean, in my view, conservatism is focused on the individual. That's the core unit. And if you're not focusing on the individual, if you're focusing on social class or a racial group or a religious group, in my view, that's not what I call proper conservatism, because I think conservatism is about the autonomy of the individual, which obviously leads itself to the free market economic system. My slight concern what's clear, there's a lot of people on the left who think in terms of groups. So they think in terms of racial group, or they think in terms of social class. Or there's a whole menagerie of different classifications they use. My criticism of Trump is I think sometimes he does the same. And I think that's where the distinction between conservatism and a more kind of authoritarian, identitarian form of right-wing politics starts to blur a bit. And I think that's why there are people on the left who use it as an attack line. So, I mean, like when he announced his candidacy in 2015, obviously the famous quote about Mexico sending over rapists and sending over murderers, and I think it was and some good people as well or something. I mean, that was crossing the line, in my view, into seeing rather than seeing Mexicans as individuals, with their individual characteristics, seeing them as a group, seeing them as a kind of collective, as Mexican immigrants, and holding them all accountable collectively for the actions of their group. And I think that's, for me, tending away. I mean, I know it's partly a matter of definition, but that for me is tending away from what I'd call conservatism. It's moving towards collectivism, a right-wing form of collectivism. But people like Milo Yiannopoulos, Stephen Crowder, I think take that one step further. And some of their politics starts to almost feel like a mirror of some of the stuff the left does. So whereas the left talks, it can be done quite subtly, but when the left talks in groups about the working class is oppressed, racial minorities are oppressed, and so forth, there definitely are some commentators on the right. I mean, I wouldn't call them conservatives, but I think they're on the right who almost mirror that the other way around. So they'll say that the white population is oppressed, or that the Native American, was say Native Americans, as in people who are born in America, are oppressed. I think that as soon as you stop seeing people as individuals and start taking a collectivist view, you're on quite dangerous territory.
I agree. Yeah, there's a lot of people who prop themselves up as unelected spokespersons, people, whatever, for an entire group. And yeah, when Trump said back when he was campaigning, right? That's when he said the Mexico thing on the campaign trail, right? When he said that they're bringing drugs, they're crime, they're rapists. That was not politically correct, obviously. But at the same time, I would say, like, what did he get wrong about it? I get the whole, like, well, it sounds like he's talking about all Mexicans. He's not the best at wording things. I could have worded that much differently, more articulate than he could have. Again, I'm not going to defend everything he says, but I don't think making that statement saying that there's a lot of problems coming across the southern border. It's not just from Mexico, by the way. It's like central. You can really talk about, well, it's Guatemala is the problem, or El Salvador, where you have MS-13, as opposed to just saying Mexico in general to describe all people coming from that region. If it had been more fine-tuned, then it sounds more intentional than I'm trying to paint brown people. Like V had said, which he later did say, he talked about the specifics of human trafficking and how much fentanyl comes across the border and how many Honduran gangs are coming over and that kind of thing. Then it sounds a little bit less potent and less, I guess, offensive, you know. But I found that with a lot of people who have been interviewed on the streets, just kind of random Hispanics, they're like, yeah, I don't like the way that he worded it, but he didn't get it wrong. I mean, that's the truth of the matter. It's the harsh truth. It's the truth that people weren't ready to hear. They didn't believe. People couldn't believe when he said that, right? I think that's when the whole racist thing came. And then they did the same thing when he talked about the banning people from coming from Muslim countries. They still to this day call it a Muslim ban, even though it's not a Muslim ban when you consider the fact that North Korea and Venezuela are on the list, and it has nothing to do with their religious faith. I mean, Muslim is not a race. You know, it's not about race because Venezuela, South Korea, yeah, those are obviously Asian, Hispanic countries, but it has to do with the politics of the country, not the people in it. It's political, it has to do with safety. But they're using that to say, well, look what Trump is standing for. Look what's that. It's a hypocrisy, man.
He did call it a Muslim ban himself, didn't he?
I don't think I heard him say. I haven't heard him say a Muslim ban. I've heard the first time I heard Muslim ban was from people on Twitter, your celebrities, athletes, entertainers. Before you know it, it was circulating, and you know, everything turns into a hashtag on Twitter, right?
I don't know what
Muslim ban.
I don't know what he said since he became president, but so during the presidential election campaign, he said something along the lines of we need a complete shutdown of Muslims coming into the United States, which made me that for me made me really, really, really uncomfortable, because that was, again, it's looking at things in collectivist terms. It's rather than looking at a Muslim as an individual, it's looking at Muslims as a group and saying they're bad, and so that it's an identitarian view of politics. And whilst I'm very critical when the left does identitarian politics, which I think it does an awful lot, it's probably more of an issue on the left than the right. But I'm also very critical when people on the right do it. And I think some of what Trump does has crossed the line into identitarian politics himself, into classifying people as groups rather than individuals. I mean, so if we look at the ban which currently, well, the ban which he actually imposed, I mean, it's not quite a Muslim ban. You're right, because there were non-Muslim countries included. I mean, I guess a critic would say they were only included so that people would say it wasn't a Muslim ban, it wouldn't be quite as offensive. But even that being the case, I think banning everyone from, Iraq, or I'm not saying that anyone from Iraq or Syria or any of these countries should be allowed to come live in the United States. Just having a blanket ban where no one who holds Iraqi citizenship or Syrian citizenship can come to the United States, I think there's a horribly kind of collectivist way of looking at things, and I think that crosses the line into bigotry in some areas. I mean, let's say ISIS, for example. I mean, people who did most of the fighting on the ground against ISIS were Syrian and Iraqis. It was members of the Syrian military, the Iraqi military, Kurdish militias, etc. Now, under Trump's policy, none of those people would, under any circumstances, be allowed to enter the United States. So the leader of the Kurdish resistance against ISIS would be banned from entering the United States, whereas potentially, an Islamic fundamentalist from one of the countries that wasn't included on the list would be allowed in. So I think it was an attack almost on the whole country. It's a very collectivist way of thinking. I mean, and as Sean said, I think initially he was talking about as a Muslim ban. I think he got that rhetoric. But it made me very uncomfortable the way he was looking at people, kind of talking about groups rather than individuals, and kind of holding people collectively responsible.
Yeah, I actually did not hear him say anything about banning Muslims. The only thing I remember, because like I said, again, I was not paying attention to him on the campaign trail. I did go back and watch some of the debates with he and Hillary, but just like his random rallies and stuff, I didn't hear anything like that. I've heard clips of him saying like radical Islamic terrorism, I've also heard him defend, most recently even, how Muslims are being treated in China.
Yeah.
So then that basically goes against the narrative that he hates Muslims and that kind of stuff. And obviously, if it were a true Muslim ban, we would be banning all the Muslim countries, not just the handful, right? And then again, going back to the hypocrisy, like no religion is more hated than Christianity. Christianity is banned pretty much from every public square. They don't want Christians speaking. They do all kind of crazy stuff. And so the reason why I always come back to that is because if we're going to talk about it, we should talk about all of it. All religious bigotry is bad. It's not just Trump. It's not just people on the right. It's people on it's people, right? At that point, you kind of have to extract the political leanings out of it and just say there are bad people in this world who think this about this religion or this race of people or this country. They're just bad people. And it doesn't matter who they voted for or what they think the corporate tax rate should be.
I really agree with that, but I think the key point is you have to think of them as individuals. So when you impose the ban on the whole of Syria or the whole of Iraq, I mean, even if you drop the rhetoric about it being a Muslim ban, you're still banning people based on where they're from, and rather than looking at them as kind of individual people. I think that's quite problematic. You make a very interesting point about Christians being persecuted. I mean, that clearly is a huge issue with Christians being persecuted, both in countries which I suppose you might say have a kind of a communist, at least origin, so like North Korea and China, and in in some Islamic countries. But I think the best way to I don't think the best way to apply is almost to kind of fight fire with fire. I don't think you should respond to that by banning people from certain countries that happen to be Muslim from entering America or entering Europe or whatever. I mean, obviously, you can't have a limited immigration. I'm not arguing that for 1 second, but in terms of people being able to visit, if they're, they got the right visas and that kind of thing, I think that just crosses the line for me into bigotry, and that kind of makes me uncomfortable. I don't know exactly what the intent was behind it. Clearly, I suppose it's partly a national security thing, and I get that, but I think you have to concentrate on keeping out the bad people, the bad individuals, not whole groups that contain bad people. That's kind of my thinking.
Well, I want to ask this quickly. Are you willing to retroactively apply this to Obama? I know you said you didn't like Obama either, his policies and stuff, but Obama literally came up with a list of countries that should be banned. Obama used very similar rhetoric to Trump on immigration. Obama actually caged kids. But the thing is, when Obama was president, I didn't hear a peep out of anyone. Now, all of a sudden, because it's Donald Trump, everyone's morally outraged. But if it were literally verbatim said by Obama, they were radio silent. The media was silent. Again, the media, I think, plays the biggest role in this because they shielded Obama, insulated him almost from criticism. And it wasn't until after his presidency that we're like, wait a minute, that wasn't a scandal-free presidency. Look at all the uranium one and all this other stuff, Benghazi, all the crap with the State Department, weaponizing the DOJ, spying on Trump, all that stuff came out afterwards. It's the media, it's people who are just blatant hypocrites that pretend to care now, but they didn't care before. And so that's part of the reason why I have a YouTube channel. I'm challenging those people. Either you care about it or you don't. But you don't get to just point the laser at Trump, like Trump. It's Donald Trump. Everything wrong is Trump. His rhetoric, his banning people. He hates Muslims. He hates gays. He hates black people. All these things, 90% of them are lies, number one. Number two, I didn't hear the same passionate outcry when Joe Biden said things, Chuck Schumer, Nancy Pelosi, Barack Obama, Hillary Clinton, the list goes on and on. Right? I don't hear it. So it makes me think it's selective outrage. You don't really, I'm not talking about you. I'm saying as if I had an audience of people that I'm actually addressing, right? Yes. I'm not talking about you guys. I'm like, either you care about it or you don't. But you don't get to cherry pick and say, well, now I'm pissed because Trump's in office. But as soon as we go back to the way things were, I'm going to be silent because my team won. We're good. We're the best. We win. We're so not racist. I can pat myself on the back. Look, I did a good job. I love people. These are the fake people that I think are the biggest problem, because we're not attacking the issue, we're attacking the person. You know, that's the biggest problem that I just have it in general. I'm going to go on a quick little necessary detour and talk about black on black crime in this country. Now, a lot of conservatives stick to the statistics and the facts. Like, look, black on black crime is the number one reason people are dying in the black community, outside of abortion, of course. But black on black murders far exceed the number of white people killing black people, far exceeds the number of cops killing black people. But we only ever hear about it on the news if a white person killed the black person. There was a little 7-year-old girl at the beginning of this year named Jasmine Barnes, who everyone forgot about now. She's a 7-year-old black girl shot dead in her mom's car. It was a horrible story. It made the headlines across the nation. Everyone was talking about it because they thought the suspect was white, but then a black killer confessed and they dropped the story. For me, that made my heart sink, because it was never about the little 7-year-old girl who lost her life. It was about a political narrative. It was about an agenda. And they only cared because it was expedient at that moment and they could get clicks. When the story was retracted, they didn't even do anything. They didn't issue any corrections, nothing. They just let it go. Yeah. So that's what I mean by, like, we're all pawns on a chessboard. We really are. It's despicable. I can't stand it. It's disgusting. And that's why I want to talk about the root of this problem. The root is, it's evil. It's coming from powers far higher up than our federal government, than our direct media. It's people much higher up that are pulling the strings and making all this happen, right? And that's why I try to pivot the discussion always. That would be the long range plan for me, is to just get everybody to try to look at the bigger picture instead of all of this political partisan fighting and let's look at Trump, let's look at that. I'm like, let's look at the issue. Who cares who's doing it? Let's attack the issue. If you want to criticize that person, fair, cool. But you got to criticize that person or I'm going to call you fake.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very important, whether you're on the left or the right, not to say everything in racial terms. To see, as I keep saying, to see people as individuals. I mean, I completely agree that there keep people attacking Trump for doing things that Obama did. I mean, obviously Obama maintained border control. I mean, I agree with him. I think that was the right thing to do. I think a country has to have some level of border control. And are there people on the left who are criticizing Trump more for some of the same policies or similar policies run under Obama? Almost certainly. But I think the converse is also true. I think there are some conservatives who said that immigration is totally out of control under Obama. It's a complete mess. It's disgusting. But now under Trump, the rate of illegal immigration, my understanding, I think it's fallen a bit, but not that much. They then say that everything's now under control, everything's now great. We've got a strong president who's dealing with it. So I think there's political partisans on both sides who will only defend or attack a Republican or Democrat president, even if they're doing exactly the same policies. My issue with Trump on kind of identitarian stuff was that I expect identitarianism from the left. That's very common. We get it all the time. My issue was I felt that Trump was starting to dabble in it as well, with some of his comments about Mexicans and some of the things he said about Muslims. And that for me was taking a step away from conservatism and something kind of more authoritarian. And in some ways, almost mirroring the tactics of the left. As I say, the left constantly talks about people in terms of racial groups or in terms of your social class. And my view is the right should avoid that. That's what we're against. But there are some people who consider themselves on the right who are trying to fight fire with fire, and I think that's very dangerous.
Yeah. I guess just to wrap it up, because I do have another thing that I got to get to. I just want to say, like, this has been an amazing conversation. This is great. I have so much. Pleasure. Thank you for inviting me on this, Sean. This is great. Absolutely. I think it's very important that we have, intellectual conversations, right, and try to learn from each other. I feel like the political discourse has just devolved into insults and hatred and violence and ultimately no conversation. There's been no crossover. We need to get back to that confluence where we're actually having these conversations where we're expanding minds and engaging in ideas and stuff like that. So it's been great. I just want to say I support Trump. Half the reason I support Trump is because of the political establishment. He was not my pick in 2016. I didn't vote for him. But I wasn't I didn't join the anti-Trump train. I wasn't on that. After he won, I was like, well, that's interesting, but I'm going to be open-minded. We'll see what happens. And now that we're approaching 2020, I'm like, I'm 100% voting for Trump, because when I look at the other side of the political aisle, I see radicalism, socialism. I see an unrecognizable political party, and it's lurching ever farther and farther and farther left, with no checks and balances within the ideology. It's just politics is downstream from culture, and culture is lurching left. Going back to people pulling the strings up top, who influences the culture going left? Hollywood, entertainment, academia. It's moving left, and politicians are moving left with it. So that said, I think Trump is the best possible candidate for 2020. Plain and simple. I mean, even if you put Rand Paul there, who Rand Paul was probably my guy. If he got the nomination in 2020 or 2016, I would have voted for him. Rand Paul would be the best choice. For as much as I can't stand neoconservative people like Mitt Romney, I would vote for Mitt Romney over anybody on the left. People who are trying to encroach on my individual liberties, people who don't want to give me the option to make the best choices for my life. Like, nobody knows what's best for me but me. I don't believe in any of their one-size-fits-all solutions. I am diametrically opposed to everything they stand for. I can't see a single policy that benefits me. And freedom is my birthright, and I have the right to choose what I want to do with my life. And government does not decide. They don't grant me my rights, because if they grant me my rights, they can take them away. The only thing they should be doing is preserving them, protecting them, preventing encroachment from coercion and governments, like other dictators, foreign and domestic, you know what I'm saying? Like, that's why I'm not budging from my position on Trump. He's not perfect. He's not great, whatever. I love what he's doing as president, but he's not a perfect person. Neither am I, right? I just see it as there's a lot of sinister, evil things happening on the other side of this, and they're just throwing mud at Trump. It's all one big distraction. So that's pretty much my spiel.
Yeah, no, I mean to kind of echo that point, I know I've really enjoyed it. It's been great, guys, and really, really interesting. I think these are the conversations that people need to have. So obviously we come from kind of a different, I think we represent different types of conservatism, but we're still both within the movement. And it's good that we can kind of, discuss these things rather than just scream abuse at each other. As I say, I agree with a lot of what you say. I disagree with other bits. But I think the dialogue's really important. So yeah, guys, it's been a real pleasure. And thanks a lot for having me on, Sean.
Yeah, no problem. I want to echo the same thing, that I really appreciate you guys coming on. Like, I lean more towards the left. I have a lot of uncertainty about my political positions, which is why I'm not predisposed to like yell at people if they say different things, because it's all interesting to me. So thank you guys for both coming on, and yeah, it's been a lot of fun.